Hi, my name is Jim Whattam with First State Woodturners. Welcome to my shop. Today we're going to begin the first part of what will be a two-part presentation on an introduction to segmented wood turning. In the first part that we're going to do today, we're going to review the very basics of segmented wood turning, such as what is segmented wood turning, why would you want to consider doing it, what types of equipment do you likely already have in your shop that you could use to do segmented wood turning, just to try it out without having to spend a lot of time on making specialized jigs or money on buying specialized jigs. How you might be able to set up that equipment accurately to make the cuts that you need to make the segmented ring that we're going to be focusing on here. And then we're going to show you some of the basics about how you go about calculating the actual construction of the segmented ring, and then how you glue it, clamp it, sand it, adhere it to your piece, and turn it on the lathe. So that we're clear on what the focus of this presentation is going to be today, that first segment that we're working on today will be a very, very simple project where we're going to show you how to design and construct a single simple segmented ring that you'll be able to use as an accent piece on an existing solid wood bowl that you may have in your shop. The second part of the presentation that we're going to do next month will focus on building on the skills that we'll teach you today. And in that second part of the presentation, we'll be constructing a number of segmented rings that we will then stack into a solid wood bowl, or a solid bowl that is fully segmented, and that way you can build on the techniques that we'll teach you hopefully today. A couple other preliminary items to note. We're going to be presenting to you today a significant amount of fairly detailed information, and I want to make sure people don't think they have to write anything down. As a part of this presentation, we will provide on the First State Woodturners website and on the social media platforms that we'll be posting this video on, we'll provide a link to a PowerPoint presentation that will be uploaded in PDF format, so you don't need the PowerPoint program, but it'll be in PDF format, and that PowerPoint presentation will contain pretty much all of the detailed information that we're going to be giving you today. So don't feel the need to try to write anything down or replay this. It's not necessary. It'll be in the PowerPoint presentation. The other preliminary thing to note is that the tips and techniques that you're going to see us use today in the shop are simply the ones that have worked for me. I have been a woodworker for most of my adult life, over 50 years, but mostly as a flat woodworker. I have been wood turning only the past 5 years, and only segmented wood turning over probably the last 4 years. So all of those tips and techniques don't come from a lifetime of activities in this area, but rather just the last few years. But they are things that I think they certainly have worked for me. But we're not by any means going to try to tell you that those are the only correct ways to do things. As with so many other aspects of woodworking and wood turning, there are many, many ways to do the same job well. Probably the first thing that we want to talk about here is to describe what segmented wood turning really is. Purely technically, segmented wood turning is a type of turning in which the blank that you're putting on the lathe to turn is created out of two or more separate pieces that you have glued together before putting it on the lathe. That covers a huge expanse of things that you can turn. For example, if you were to simply glue pieces of wood together and stack them up vertically, you'd come up with a piece that might look something like that, out of which you can turn something like a little potpourri bowl. That is segmented wood turning. Or you can simply turn those same pieces horizontally instead of vertically, and all of a sudden you have yourself a little bowl. Again, segmented wood turning, because you are taking different segments of wood and gluing them together before you turn it. Something, for example, like even this soccer ball is technically, it's segmented wood turning, because you are gluing together a series of hexagons and pentagons all in a round shape and turning a soccer ball out of it. Again, segmented wood turning. something like a 3D illusion bowl, such as this one, is also an example of segmented wood turning, where you are taking what really are 3 to 4 foot lengths of wood cut in these shapes. You're gluing them together, cutting them into 4-inch blocks, stacking those blocks up, gluing them all together, putting it on the lathe, and making a bowl out of it. Again, segmented wood turning. But those aren't the kinds of things we're going to be talking about in detail today, just like we're not going to be talking so much about another type of segmented wood turning. This is stave construction, vertical pieces of wood. This is actually an angled stave construction. I don't have a completed one in the shop, so we'll have to do with this one. But that's another type of segmented wood turning. Yet another very common type of segmented wood turning that most of you have probably seen but might not know the name of is called open segmented, where essentially, if you were to look at this vase, there would be gaps between the various segments, holes, if you will, between the various segments at each level. That type of segmented turning doesn't use rings. It actually uses the individual pieces that are put in one at a time, glued in place one at a time with gaps in between the various segments, called open segmenting. Doesn't use, for the most part, rings for the construction, maybe at the very top and bottom, but the bulk of the body of open segmenting doesn't use rings. Still segmented turning. What we're going to be talking about, though, is something that, for lack of a better term, we'll simply refer to as traditional segmented wood turning, where we are actually constructing the various rings that are eventually going to be stacked together. In our case today, we're just going to use one single ring for our project, but traditional segmented wood turning is where you are doing solid rings that are stacked together to make a fully segmented piece like this vase. So what we're going to be dealing with then is just very traditional segmented wood turning, constructing just that single ring that we talked about at the beginning. The next topic we want to discuss is, why would you want to consider doing segmented wood turning? It seems intimidating to a lot of folks, but hopefully in the course of this presentation we'll show you that it really can be done in a way that shouldn't be intimidating at all. And there are a number of reasons why, certainly why I got involved in doing segmented wood turning, and why I think it's something you seriously ought to consider to expand your horizons as a wood turner. One of the things that we're used to doing as wood turners is simply taking a big block of wood that Mother Nature has made available to us, throwing it on the lathe and having at it with our gouges. But not all of us have access to large blocks of wood that we can create something like a 14-inch bowl like this one. You might not have access to that kind of wood, or you might have access to it, but the pieces of wood that you have might have splits, checks, knots, the types of imperfections in it that you don't want in your piece. Well, segmented wood turning gives you a way to get around that. Another reason you might want to look at it is, if you're anything at all like me, you're in your 70s and it's becoming more and more difficult to lift those big honking pieces of wood up onto the lathe. Segmented wood turning gives you a way to avoid having to do that. The heaviest piece of wood that you're going to deal with in segmented wood turning is whatever board you use to cut the wood strips out of that we're eventually going to cut up into little segments. So you don't have to worry about lifting those big heavy pieces of wood up onto the lathe. And another good reason for looking at segmented wood turning is, if you wanted to turn something that's a particularly large piece, it can be expensive if you have to buy a very large solid block of wood. Segmented wood turning allows you to create essentially a very large finished piece out of relatively small amounts of wood that are much more cost effective. In addition to those reasons, though, probably the most important reasons, for me at least, as to why I got into segmenting a few years ago and why I've enjoyed it so much, is the color and design options that are available to you once you know how to do segmented wood turning. Mother Nature doesn't give us single pieces of wood with multiple colors in it, other than maybe flame box elder or something. But for the most part, we don't get a whole lot of variation in wood color in the pieces that Mother Nature makes available to us. Segmenting, on the other hand, allows you to let your imagination be your guide. You can do something like a bowl like this that has multiple different colors in it. Again, something that Mother Nature would never provide to us in a single piece of wood. The color and design choices that are available to you are really limited only by your imagination. If, for example, you decide you want to turn for whatever reason, a 36-inch long by 20-inch in diameter floor urn, you can do that without having to use a crane to lift a big, heavy piece of wood up onto your lathe to turn it. You can create it entirely out of segmented rings with relative ease, generally done in 2 sections and glued together at the end, but you can do that using the techniques of segmented wood turning. So the reasons why segmented wood turning are great are manifold, as I said. The primary one for me being the design and shape options that you can do whatever you want to do, color-wise, design-wise. You can even, for example, in addition to using the traditional rings that we have, create what are called in the segmenting world feature rings, something like this feature ring in the center of this vase, or the feature ring in the center of this tureen. Those are options that Mother Nature simply doesn't make available to you, that you can create in your shop and add for further design opportunities in your piece. Again, an option that only segmented wood turning makes available to you. So those are just some of the reasons why you might want to consider doing segmented wood turning. All right, next we want to talk about what equipment you might need in your shop in order to do segmented wood turning. Obviously, since this is a wood turners group, we assume all of you have lathes, and you certainly need a lathe to do this. But what other type of equipment do you really need to be able to do segmented wood turning? I guess the best thing to say is that the most ideal additional piece of equipment you can have in your shop is a table saw, because a table saw allows you to do both of the 2 primary functions that you'll need in order to get into segmented wood turning, which is the creation of the wood strips that you will ultimately use to cut the segments from. However, if you don't have a table saw, you certainly can perform both of those functions very effectively on a bandsaw. A bandsaw, if properly adjusted and with an appropriate blade, will allow you to cut the wood strips that you need, and also allow you, with the aid of a properly adjusted miter gauge, to cut the segments that you need in order to make a segmented ring. You can also use a miter saw in the shop to cut the segments. Unfortunately, you can't use that to create the wood strip. So if all you have in your shop in addition to your lathe is a miter saw, you're going to need to find a friend who has either a table saw or a bandsaw to allow you to cut the strips from that you'll have to use in the process of creating the segments. So those are the 3 major pieces of equipment that we're going to show you how to use how to set up and how to use to cut the segments necessary to create the segmented ring that we're going to be used for our project. Next, we're going to start out with an explanation of what a segment is. Pretty basic point of information for segmented wood turning. What you see in front of you is a basic segmented ring. Each individual piece is what we'll refer to as a segment. In larger form, it would look like this, essentially a trapezoid in geometric terms. And the ring is composed of a series of those segments, all arranged hopefully in a circle that joins up evenly without any joints. From a geometry perspective, keep in mind we're talking about a ring, which means a 360-degree circle. The objective in segmented turning is to create a ring that has nice tight joints in all of these. This is I guess a 10-segment ring. And we want to make sure that each of those 10 segments, which involve 2 cuts on each joint, so you've got a total of 20 cut surfaces, around this segment, around this ring, you want to make sure that each of those cuts is done accurately. Why? Because if that cut is off, even by a degree, and if this is a 10 segment ring, we don't want it to be off even a degree, because if it's off a degree, that can have a significant adverse impact on whether those joints will close up. As an example, here we have a segmented ring that was intentionally cut at an incorrect number of degrees. This is a 16 segment ring that we'll review in a few minutes, the formulas that you use to calculate what degree the cut should be made. But basically this should have been cut at 11.25 degrees, 11.25 degrees for each cut. But I intentionally cut it at 10.25 degrees so that you could see the impact that a 1 degree error in how you have your equipment set up, how that will impact how the segments fit. As you'll see, there are significant gaps in this ring, gaps that cannot be pulled together in any way by tightening this hose clamp. And one of the fundamentals of segmented wood turning is you don't want to have to use a hose clamp to close up the gaps in your ring. You want your ring to fit perfectly tightly, just like this ring fits perfectly tightly without any clamps having to be applied to it. So accuracy is critical in segmented wood turning. Next, we want to take a look at what woods should you consider using in segmented wood turning. There's one operative rule that we need to emphasize for segmented wood turning, and that is that you should never ever use green wood in segmented wood turning. Any type of green wood will be disastrous if you try to use it for segmented wood turning, because as it dries, the joints that you've created will certainly open up, and you will unexpectedly have an open segmented piece rather than a traditional closed segment piece. So by all means, don't ever consider using green wood. You should generally only use kiln dried, tight grained hardwoods, such as, and you'll see some examples in front of me, Paduke, yellow heart, purple heart, hard maple, walnut, wenge, American holly, bloodwood. Any tight grained hardwoods are what you ought to be using for segmented wood turning. It's generally not considered a good idea to be using too many softwoods, although candidly I see lots of pieces on social media sites that are made out of poplar, even pine. Frankly, many out of plywood. Seen some interesting pieces made out of plywood. But for traditional segmented wood turning, the general advice is to stick with tight-grained hardwoods rather than any kind of softwood at all, or open-grade woods like oak, I guess. Although again, I've seen many pieces done with oak. But for the most part, try to stick with kiln-dried, tight-grained hardwood. If it's not kiln-dried, if it's air-dried, make sure you test the moisture content of that wood before you use it for segmenting. Don't guess. Make sure you use a moisture meter to verify what the moisture content is. Don't assume, since it's been in your shop for a number of years, that it's necessarily fully air-dried before you use it for segmenting. So try to make sure you're using known moisture content for that kind of wood. The next aspect of wood selection is what width of strips might I need to create in order to make a segmented ring such as the type that I need. What width of strip and what length of strip. Well, we'll get into the details of calculating the length of the strip in a little bit. But in terms of the width of the strips to use, that's going to be fairly easy for us today, because we're just creating one simple ring to go on an existing rough-turned solid wood bowl. So that's pretty straightforward. We'll use a little over an inch wide strip. Generally though, in determining the width of wood strips that you use, it's typically considered the best idea to draw out on graph paper using simple quarter-inch block graph paper like this. Simply sketch out your design, and that way you can determine the exact width that you'll need. This is not on graph paper, but just a simple illustration of a design that will show you how the width of strip that you will use will vary depending on where that strip sits within the curvature of your design. For example, in the section that's almost vertical in the piece, you need a very narrow strip. About an inch wide strip is fine. But up to towards the top of the piece, where there's a significant curvature within that same 3/4 inch height of your piece, you'll need maybe 2.5 inch wide strips for cutting the segments for those rings. So width will depend on where it sits in the piece, and we'll review that in a little greater detail in the second part of our presentation when we create a full bowl. But for our purpose, something in the 1 to 1.5 inch range would be more than adequate for what we need to prepare our ring out of. All right, now that we have some of the preliminaries out of the way, let's talk a little bit about the specifics of ring construction, particularly related to simply adding an accent ring to the top of a solid wood bowl. The first thing we need to do, of course, is to decide how large that ring needs to be. So let's take a look at a specific bowl and try to see how you would design the size of the ring that you need for that particular bowl. Now in front of me I have just a sample of a bowl, and let's assume that we are going to try to add an accent ring to the top of this bowl. You will see that this bowl is roughly 8.5 inches in diameter. If I were to create an 8.5 inch ring, exactly the diameter of the bowl, this is what we would end up with, because the 8.5 inch diameter when you're doing basic ring construction is the point-to-point measurement on a ring. It is the furthest apart points on the ring, and of course this is still a segmented ring. It's not round, so once you round it off, it's actually going to end up significantly less than 8.5 inches in diameter. So what do we have to do in order to make sure that we have enough width to the ring to ensure that it will cover the full diameter of the bowl once we have it turned round? Well, that's where in the segmented world we have to add what's called a fudge factor, or padding, in connection with the sizing of the ring that we need. For example, in a 10 segment ring like this, where this one clearly does not fit on the bowl after it's turned around, it would be way too small, I simply add a 1/2 inch to the rough ring diameter. So instead of an 8.5 inch diameter ring, I would use for my calculation a 9 inch diameter ring and start out with that as my rough ring size. That would be different if the ring that I was using had more segments in it, because as you add more segments to a ring, the ring becomes closer and closer to round already. So you don't need to add as much of a fudge factor to it to get the final turned ring to fit the diameter that you need. But for a 10 segment ring like this, I tend to add a 1/2 inch. That gives you more than enough extra space. And that's what this second ring is. This is a 9 inch diameter ring instead of the 8.5 inch diameter ring, where the measurement here is 9 inches instead of 8.5. And as you can see, we have more than enough space here that once turned round, this will certainly fit on the top of this bowl. The reason that we need to determine the rough ring diameter at this point is that will allow us to calculate how long we need to cut the wood strips that we're going to use for cutting the segments that we need for our segmented ring. Again, since a segmented ring is a circle, we need to be able to determine the circumference of the circle. This harkens back to high school geometry, where in order to calculate the circumference of a circle, you simply multiply the diameter of the circle by pi, which is 3.14 and a whole lot of additional decimal places that are not in any way relevant to us. And I know the math geeks among us, their heads are exploding right about now because they want to calculate it out to 26 decimal places, but it's really not necessary. 3.14 is fine. Candidly, 3.1 will work for this purpose. We simply need to calculate the circumference of the circle. So if we have a 9 inch diameter ring like this, it's 9 times pi, 3.1, or 27.9, make it 28. And then because we're calculating the length of the wood strip we need, we don't want to be cutting right down to the very nub at the end of the strip. We want to add a little bit so that our fingers are protected a little bit as we're cutting those strips. So I add 5 inches. You can add whatever amount you want depending on how much of a safe amount of space you want to be able to be away from the little sharp spinny thing, the blade. So I simply calculate the circumference, add 5 inches to it. That's the length of the strip that we're going to need, since that's relevant to where we are at this point in the design process. So circumference being diameter times pi plus 5 inches, there you have your strip length. All right, now that we have decided on the final ring size, the rough ring size that we need to create, and we have decided on what wood we're going to use, we've cut the wood in the right width that we need, we've cut it to the right length that we need, then we have to begin the process of determining how to cut it into segments that will make the size ring that we've decided that we need. How many segments you decide to put in a ring, it's really determined by typically one of two things. One would be your design. Obviously, you can design it to have as many segments in the ring as you want. The other factor that may impact how many segments you want to put in your ring is what equipment you have available to set up your table saw, bandsaw, or miter saw to cut the correct angle for that number of segments. Because as you change the number of segments in a ring, that will obviously change the angle at which those miters are cut. So you need to make sure you have equipment available that will allow you to accurately set up your equipment to cut the specific angle necessary for that number of segments. Now, again, because it's largely a design function, you have to decide the look that you want. For example, the ring that I have here is a simple 8-segment ring. That has a very different look to it, for example, than this other ring, which is a 24-segment ring. That has obviously it is much closer to approximating a rounded circle, doesn't have the sharp points that the 8-segment ring does, but it also has a very different look from the side when you're going to put it on top of your piece. So you have to decide what you want it to look like. And obviously consider what equipment you have available to you to set up the cuts that are necessary to create whatever ring your design chooses. Now, in calculating what the angle is that's necessary to produce the number of segments that you decide on, again, there's a number of ways that you can make that determination as to what that correct angle of cut is. You can certainly look at the charts that are available on the internet. You can also seek out the computer programs that segmenters use. They're referenced in the PowerPoint presentation that we'll make available along with this video. Those computer programs also will print out for you what the angle of cut needs to be. Or you can use simple basic geometry to figure it out yourself. Again, it's not particularly difficult at all. If you know the number of segments you want in a ring and you know the size of the ring, well, you know that the ring is 360 degrees. That's true for every ring, no matter what the ring size is, no matter what the number of segments that you're using. You've got a 360-degree ring. And the formula that you use to determine that ring is a simple one based on the number of segments that you decide on. For example, this 24-segment ring, if you think about it, it's very clear. Each of these 24 joints has 2 cut surfaces on it. So there are 48 cut surfaces on it. So the formula is simply to take the 360 degrees and divide that by 2 times the number of segments. That'd be 48. So you would divide the 360 by 48, and that gives you the degree of cut. For example, if you had a 12-segment ring, you would divide 360 by 24. We're going to be using a 12-segment ring for our project here. A 12-segment ring has 24 cut surfaces on it, so you would divide 360 by 24, and you get 15 degrees. You don't need a calculator to do that. or at least a computer program. You might need a calculator, but not a computer program, or a chart off the internet. It's 360 degrees divided by 2 times the number of segments in your ring. That gives you the degree of cut. And we'll use that 15-degree setting as the setting that is going to be set up on each of the pieces of equipment that we're going to look at later on in this video. All right, now that we know the final rough ring size that we need, and we've decided on the number of segments that we want to have in our ring, and we've decided on the wood that we're going to use, the width of the strip that we're going to use, the length of the strip based on the circumference that we've already calculated, we then have to decide on one final measurement, and that is what segment length do we need in order to produce a ring that will be that final ring diameter. Now, segment length is, if this is just a sample segment, segment length is the long edge of the segment on the outside of the ring where it fits here on the ring. So we need to know how to calculate what that segment length is so that it will produce the final ring size that we need. That calculation is, again, a very simple formula. As before, though, you can get that off of charts on the internet, you can get it off of computer programs designed for segmenters, or you can just calculate it yourself using simple high school geometry, which is to take, once again, the circumference of the ring, which is diameter times pi, diameter times, if this is 10 inches, for example, it'd be 10 inches times pi, 3.14, or 31.4 inches. You would then divide that 31.4 by the number of segments you have in the ring. If there are 12 segments in the ring, and this is 31.4 inches all the way around, it would be 31.4 divided by 12, or 2.62 inches. You don't have to go crazy to the hundredth of an inch, but basically 2.6 inches you would need as a segment length for each of these segments in the ring. And if you get very close to 2.62 inches as your segment length, you're going to end up with a ring that is very close to the 10-inch diameter that you need as your final ring size. So the next thing we're going to do is to go to each of the pieces of equipment that you might be able to use in your shop and show you how to use those pieces of equipment to produce the segment length that you need, cut at the right angles and at the right segment length in order to produce the size ring that we need for our project. All right, now we're going to look at using the miter saw that you may have in your shop for cutting the segments necessary to produce the ring that we want to put on a solid wood bowl. This miter saw, like most of them, has 2 fixed stops that can be used for cutting fairly standard segmented rings, a 22.5 degree stop for an 8-segment ring, or a 15 degree stop that will produce a 12-segment ring like this one. So you certainly can use these fixed stops, but they'll only be good to use if your saw is accurately set up so that you know that the 22.5 degree stop in fact is adjusted at 22.5 degrees. So you need to check that to verify what those settings are, or you can use any other degree setting that you want to cut a different number of segments in your ring if that's what you decide to do. There are a couple techniques you can use to verify what the setting is. Probably the easiest to use is a digital protractor, which allows you to set it at pretty much any degree that you want, and that's set by, and the saw is unplugged, so it's safe to be close to the blade. You would use the digital protractor to set it at whatever degree setting you want. If this is currently set at the 15 degree setting, so it's 15 degrees off of 90 degrees. So this particular angle would be the corresponding angle of 90 minus 15, or 75 degrees. So you would use the digital protractor to set this at 75 degrees so that you knew your angle of cut was exactly at 15 degrees that you need for a 12-segment ring, or whatever the degree setting is that you've determined you need for the number of segments that you've decided. This is probably one of the most advantageous tools that you can add to your shop if you want to do any segmenting. I think this one runs currently about $20 on the Wixie website. They're generally very accurate to within a couple of tenths of a degree. So very inexpensive kind of tool that you can use in setting up a miter saw or your miter gauge on either your table saw or your bandsaw. So an excellent simple tool that allows you to get essentially an infinite number of different degree settings. Another way you can do it is if you want to go the route of buying what we'll talk about in a little more detail at the table saw, some what are called wedgies. Wedgies are simply wedges of plastic that have been CNC cut to a specific degree for the certain number of segments that you want in your ring. For example, this is a 12 segment wedgie, and that is designed to give you a 15-degree cut for 12 segments in a ring, and you simply slide that against your blade to ensure that the long side is against your fence, the short side against the body of your blade, and that as long as that is lining up fully tightly, then you know your saw is set correctly at 15 degrees. 15 degrees off of 90, this is 75 degrees. So you can use these, but the downside of this is that you have to order a separate wedgie, which I think they run about $13 a piece on the segeasy.com website that we've listed on our PowerPoint presentation. They're about $13 a piece, and each one is only good for that number of segments. So it can get a little pricey, although we do use these to set up a wedgie sled that we'll talk about in a few minutes on the table saw. So they're useful for certain purposes, and certainly useful here if you just want to check to ensure that your saw is set up correctly for a 12 segment ring. All right, now we have this set at 15 degrees for a 12 segment ring. So let's cut a couple of segments so you can see how you would go about doing it on the miter saw. Again, we have a stop. You need to set a stop at whatever length you need to achieve the segment length that you want. You may have to adjust that back and forth just a little bit to get the correct setting. We're not going to make all those adjustments right now, but we'll just cut a couple of things to show you, a couple of segments to show you how you can make these cuts on the miter saw without having to create a specialized jig that many turners or segmenters do that make it even safer if you're cutting them quickly, because the jig will have a hold down on it to hold down each segment as you cut it. We don't really need to do that if we use the correct cutting technique with a miter saw. So we'll show you how to do that, and basically it's going to involve making the cut and then turning the blade off before we raise the blade, because it's the act of raising the blade that causes the segment that you've just cut and is trapped against the fence. It's the raising of the blade that causes that segment to pop up and go against the spinning blade, and it then becomes a projectile, which we don't want since we're standing right in front of the miter saw. So I'll show you the technique you can use to avoid having to do that. It just involves turning the saw on and off more regularly. The first cut that we're going to make is to make the first cut on the end of the strip of wood that we're using for our segment. We're just using a piece of pine here as an example, and I keep a lot of pine strips in the shop just for this kind of rough cutting. Good to have any kind of strips of scrap wood around, because you're going to need to fool around a little bit to get the correct segment length in each instance. So you always do that cutting with scrap strips of wood before you switch to the finished strips that you're actually going to employ on the segmented ring. So the first cut will be to make the first end of the board at the correct 15-degree angle. So let me plug the saw in. We'll make that cut. And then we flip the strip, hold that firmly against the fence, and again, keep in mind the fence on a miter saw should never be aligned exactly with any side fences that you may have. The only fence that matters with a miter saw is the fence on the saw. There should not be fences that align perfectly with this, because if there's any warpage at all in your board, that might prevent it from holding firmly against the miter saw's fence. So whatever, if you happen to have a back fence on either or both sides of your miter saw, like this miter saw station does, make sure your miter saw sits significantly proud of that fence so there's no interference caused by either of those side fences. These are only for purposes of holding length stops. They have nothing whatsoever to do with making sure that it's tight against your saw fence. So hold it against the saw fence tightly and firmly against your stop, make the cut, and then keep the blade held down until the blade fully stops, and only then retract it. And then once it's fully stopped, then your segment is cut. To continue cutting them, you simply again flip the board, hold that firmly against the stop again, make another cut, again holding the blade down until it fully comes to a stop after the cut. And that way you avoid that blade motion coming up, pulling the segment up into a spinning blade, which you don't want to do. All right, now let's move on to the table saw. As with the miter saw, the initial setup of any piece of equipment is critical. Just as we assumed that the miter saw was correctly set up, we're going to assume here that any table saw that you might be using is similarly set up correctly, that you have a decent quality blade installed, that the blade is set at 90 degrees to the table, and that your miter slot is indeed parallel to the body of the blade. It's beyond the scope of this presentation to get into how one would do all that, but we're going to assume that everything is set up correctly. Make sure you check your table saw blade to ensure that all of those settings are correct before you begin any segmenting work, because accuracy is critical on this device, as with the miter saw and the table saw. Once again, there are a number of ways that you can set up a table saw for cutting segments. The blade angle or the miter angle for making the cuts can be set using a number of different devices. Of course, the first initial device you can use is the miter gauge itself. It has degree settings on it. We don't recommend using those settings as a final degree setting, because they're notoriously inaccurate. This is just a basic miter gauge that came with my table saw 30-some years ago. They're very coarse settings. They don't allow you to get the accuracy you want. If you try to use just that, there's going to be a lot of trial and error, which we want to try to avoid. So we're going to try to use other devices to set up, even using just a simple miter gauge like this. You don't need a really expensive one, just one that fits tightly in your slot. You don't have any side-to-side movement. It fits tightly. I will tell you that you should also make sure that, for a couple of reasons, that you don't use just the metal of the miter gauge as the backing for your strips being held against it. Wood will move way too easily when held against polished metal like this. It is critical that that wood, once you have held it against the stop, you're setting your segment length, you don't want that to move. It's much too easy to move if held against a shiny metal surface. So always put a sacrificial fence on your miter gauge, and always put just a little strip of sandpaper on it so that it will hold the piece firmly in place without any movement once you have gotten it set against your stop. And also the sacrificial fence should have a dust slot cut in the bottom of it. We don't want any of the little dust particles that will come off of all the segments that we'll be cutting, because we're going to be making a ton of cuts. We don't want them being pushed up against a solid fence here that would interfere with the piece being held firmly in place straight against the the auxiliary fence. So make sure you have both a dust slot cut in the bottom of your sacrificial fence, and that you have a little bit of sandpaper on it to hold that the wood strip in place. Now, once you have that set up, you need to make sure that this is adjusted to whatever angle that you need to cut the segments at the correct angle to give you the size ring that you need. Again, there are a number of ways to do that other than using the very coarse miter angle adjustments on the miter gauge itself. Again, the easiest one to use is to use the digital protractor, where again you can hold the, and again the saw is unplugged, so we're safe to use it here. You can see that the digital protractor can be used, and this is an 8-inch one, so it fits nicely against the body of a 10-inch blade without the teeth having to be taken into account. It fits nicely against that body blade, and you would adjust that if you want a 15-degree angle of cut. That'd be 15 degrees off of 90, so this degree measurement, the corresponding angle, would be 75 degrees. You would set the digital protractor here so that it read 75 degrees, then you know your miter gauge is set at exactly the right angle. So that's, again, one of the easiest ways to get different angles using a digital protractor. As with a miter saw, you could also use a wedgie if you wanted, from the wedgie sled site. Again, this is for a 12-segment ring, a 15-degree angle. You would again set it that way to ensure that the body of the blade is set at 15 degrees to your miter gauge. That's certainly another way that you can do it. That's an easy way to set up your basic miter gauge. There is yet another device that we'll move to right now that will provide an even quicker adjustment mechanism. All right, the next device we're going to look at for setting up a miter gauge that you could use either on your table saw or your bandsaw is a device called a miter set for segments. The Miter Set company, and again the link is in the PowerPoint presentation that we'll make available. The Miter Set Corporation makes a jig that is specifically designed for segmenters. It allows you to set your miter gauge very quickly to the correct angles necessary to cut segmented rings that have anywhere from 4 to 20 segments in them. The device, as I recall, costs about $100 currently, but obviously takes the place of any number of seg-easy wedges that would translate to the same number of segments per ring. And it's really, really quick to set. If, for example, you wanted a 12-segment ring like we are going to be using, you would simply set one pin at 0, the other pin at 12, loosen your miter gauge, hold it tightly against those two pins, tighten it up, and you are set at exactly 15 degrees. This device allows by far the most rapid changes in angle setting for segmenting of anything currently on the market. Fantastic for that specific range of segments. If you want more than 20 segments per ring, then obviously you're going to have to go to a different device, such as the digital protractor or a seg-easy wedgie that is appropriate for the number of segments per ring that you've decided to use. All right, the next device for the table saw that we're going to take a quick look at is, instead of using a basic miter gauge that you're setting with either a digital protractor or a seg-easy or a miter set for segments, we're going to look at a high-end miter gauge that doesn't need any of those devices to set, assuming that you get it initially set up fully accurately. This device allows you, and similar devices, this one is from Whattam, but there are other devices from Incra and a number of other manufacturers, a high-end type of miter gauge that allows you to set the gauge to the correct angles within tenths of a degree. They're fully adjustable, not only to full degrees, but even to tenths of a degree using the vernier scales that are on it. So this one has positive stops at each degree setting, each full degree setting. So if we wanted to set it at 15 degrees, you can just set that at the positive stop at 15 degrees, and that will be set completely accurately right at 15 degrees on its own. So you could certainly consider, you may have this in your shop if you do a lot of flat woodworking. So you may already have something like this. You can certainly use this for segmenting. One other device that can be used for setting a miter gauge of any kind, I don't have available, so I can't show you, but we referenced it on the PowerPoint presentation, and that is that Rockler, in their catalog, produces some little plastic blocks. I think it's a set of 3 of them that are $45 a set, that essentially sit between the miter gauge fence and the blade to get the correct angles for segmented rings that I think are anywhere between 4 and 12 segments per ring. So you certainly could use those as well to set whatever miter gauge you have. You wouldn't need it for something like this, but for a basic miter gauge like the other one that we were just showing you before, you could use the Rockler ones. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about the wedgie sled, which is a device that many segmenters use for cutting their segmented rings. This is a sled designed by a fellow by the name of Jerry Bennett. He is the fellow who runs the segeasy.com website and produces these wedgies that one uses to set up a wedgie sled that he designed. This is his design. The plans for this are on his website, and you can certainly build this in your shop if you're so inclined. It's just basically 2 articulating arms that you set up using a device like this, or you can actually use the digital protractor. You don't have to have wedgies. You can use a digital protractor to set this as well. Little more difficult to do, but you can. The wedgies make it really simple to set this up for the right number of segments per ring. Gives you the right angle. So this is a device that you can build. This is a little off-ramp that allows the pieces that you cut to fall off. They don't always fall off quite as far as one might like, but in any event, it allows you to cut the segments simply by holding your piece against here and against up here first, and then flip the strip, or simply move the strip over to here and make the second cut at the corresponding angle. This is a stop that you use to adjust to get the correct segment length that you want. You move this back and forth and tighten it down till you get the correct segment length that you want. And it's an excellent device for cutting segments if that's the extent to which you want to get involved in segmented turning. There is also shown on the PowerPoint presentation a wedgie-less version, it's called, of this sled. It's produced by a fellow by the name of Pete Markin. He calls his the wedgie-less sled. It is a sled that similarly has articulating arms, but it has fixed pin stops in it that are CNC drilled for great accuracy. I think it's got, I want to say, 9 or 10 different segment settings for it on the sled. It's a little bit pricey, but according to all of the reviews, I've never used one myself, but according to all the reviews, it's an outstandingly accurate sled for cutting wedges. So that's something that you can also consider as a kind of high-end version of a wedgie sled if you choose to get seriously involved in segmented turning. All right, now let's take a look at making some cuts on the table saw using just a basic miter gauge that many of you probably have in your shops if you have a table saw. This miter gauge is already set to 15 degrees to cut a 12 segment ring. Let's talk a little bit first before we do any cutting about why this strip of wood has a squiggly line on one face and a straight line on one edge. And that's because the fellow who designed the wedgie sled, Jerry Bennett, that I mentioned before, has suggested on his site, and I've followed his advice ever since, of putting these marks on the strips that you have made for cutting your segments in order to allow you to assemble the wedges, one of the segments, once you get them cut, in order to assemble them in a way that will correct for any error that may exist in your blade verticality. In other words, if you don't have it set at exactly 90 degrees, if you have it set at 89 degrees or 89.5, you might not get tight joints all the way around. You may think it's at 90 degrees, but it may be off a little bit. And by this simple action of putting a squiggly line on one face and a straight line on one edge, and assembling them as you get all the cut segments, assembling them all with the squiggly line surface up, and then alternating the straight line on either an inside face or then an outside face, and I'll show you that when we get to the assembly point, that eliminates any error in blade verticality. It's a simple step to take, only takes a second, and again eliminates any potential error in verticality that you may have. Now we're going to make a couple of cuts on the table saw. Keep in mind that whenever we're using the table saw here, we don't want to use the fence as the stop block because if we were to do that and made the cut, the segment that would be cut would be stuck between the spinning blade and the solid fence. That's generally going to result in that segment becoming a projectile, so we need a stop. It can be any kind of stop. This is one that just happens to fit in a slot I have on my fence. It doesn't have to be that way. You can use a fence that is held on with they have specialized fence clamps, or it could be just regular clamps that you're using to hold on a stop block. Whatever device you choose to use, make sure you use a stop block. This one is 3 inches out from the fence. I like to have at least 3 inches to allow sufficient space for the segments to safely clear. Generally, I'll cut a couple of segments, then turn the saw blade off, move those segments out of the way, and then continue cutting. But this stop block surface is the distance between, once this is cut, the distance between here and the blade is going to be your segment length. You may have to adjust that in order to get the exact segment length that you need, and you just adjust your fence back and forth until you get roughly the segment length that you need. Your best friend in doing that is going to be something like this digital caliper. Absolutely invaluable tool when you're doing segmenting work. Again, fairly inexpensive, but very easy to use, but very valuable in helping to determine the exact length of the segments that you're producing, because you want those segments to be as accurate as possible. So let's make a quick end cut on this piece to ensure, and the table saw is off, so let me plug it in. And now let's take a look at cutting our segments on a bandsaw. Again, as with the miter saw and the table saw, we're going to assume that you have your bandsaw set up correctly, that you've got a decent quality blade installed, that you have the blade set at exactly 90-degree angle to the tabletop, that you've got the miter slot that has a miter gauge that fits tightly in the miter slot without side-to-side movement. So we're going to assume all those things are done, and now we're going to show you how you would cut these segments on the bandsaw using a stop block that is simply, again, a sacrificial stop that is attached to the standard factory fence that comes with this old Delta bandsaw. Relatively straightforward to make these cuts. Make sure, again, you're adjusting the fence left or right to get the correct segment length that you want. You can use almost any blade. This is a 1/2-inch resaw blade that's on here. That's a little coarser than one would normally use. I left it on here to show you that you can even use a blade like this to cut segments in a way that will end up being very accurate and will form a very nice ring, even cut on the bandsaw using a simple miter gauge and the simple factory fence on this saw. So let's get this one fired up and make these cuts. All right, there are our 12 segments cut, and that's the piece that's left over from the segment, or the wood strip length that we added that extra 5 inches to. Remember, we had a little bit more than 5 inches left, which is good. Keep our fingers away from the blade. All right, now that we have the segments cut, the next thing we have to do is to sand off all the what are called fuzzies on the edges. And the reason we want to do that is very simple, because those fuzzies, if left there, could theoretically get into the joints that we're trying to get nice and tight and stop you from getting them nice and tight. So we simply sand off each of the edges very quickly. It doesn't have to be a lengthy process, but just make sure that all of the edges are lightly sanded, and then we'll talk about how to assemble them using the squiggly lines and the straight lines that we mentioned earlier. All right, now that we have all of the segments sanded, enough for our purpose here, the next thing to do is to assemble them in the order that we want to assemble them, using the squiggly lines and the straight lines on one edge. Remember, all of the squiggly line faces go up, and the solid line on the one edge are alternated, one to the inside, the next one to the outside. So you simply arrange them in that fashion so that you go one and one, and you'll see the difference as we get the ring fully assembled. And there's our segmented ring. Now we need to test it to make sure that the cuts that we made were sufficiently accurate to give us a nice tight ring. Easiest way to do that is to use a couple of zip ties. These are from Harbor Freight, very inexpensive to use and reusable many, many times. We simply use these zip ties to pull this together and arrange the segments in such a way that they're all pulled together nicely, and then we tighten it and make sure that the segments that we got have a nice tight ring to them. And see, we've got ourselves a nice tight ring, assuming I pull this together. And once we get that ring in that fashion, we know it's good enough to, once I tighten everything up, we know it's good enough to continue the assembly process and turning into a final ring that we can add to our bowl. All right, now that we have the segments all appropriately sanded, we've tested the fit to ensure that it's a tight fit on all of the joints. Now we need to glue it up. Variety of techniques that segmenters use to do this type of gluing. Many just use the rub joint technique of putting a little glue on, rubbing it together, and assembling them one by one. I happen to use what's called the blue tape method. There's no right or wrong answer. There's a whole host of different ways you can do it. I'll show you the way I do it, and you can decide whether that's something you want to do or use your own technique. But I simply lay out a stretch of blue tape and then align the pieces right along the blue tape, simply because that allows for much easier assembly once the glue is installed. Again, keeping the squiggly line all facing towards me and alternating the straight line on the one edge. All right, now that we have those all down, then we simply apply the glue to the joints. We can fast forward through a lot of this, I'm sure. Despite what some woodworkers believe, one does not need an overwhelming amount of glue in these joints. It doesn't need to be flowing luxuriously along the pieces in order to give you a quality glue joint. You can use pretty much any kind of wood glue that you want for this purpose. You don't have to have Titebond 3 to make it moisture proof, since you're not going to be subjecting it to moisture presumably. Any of the Titebonds are good. Once you're done with that, simply take off this excess piece at the end, since you don't want that to get in the way of the ultimate assembly. And then you simply flip this over, and this is the advantage of the blue tape method. Simply flip that over, and allows you to get a nice quick application of the glue, and then clean off a little of the excess, since we don't need all of that. And then we apply our ring hose clamp. You can use a variety of techniques to clamp it. I happen to be a hose clamp user. Other folks use other techniques, but I find hose clamps being probably one of the easiest clamping mechanisms to use. Just get it reasonably centered. And then I also make sure that once it is in this position, I will make sure all the pieces are down flat against the table. Do the final tightening. And then our ring is done. We simply set it aside and let the glue dry until we're ready for the next stage, which is to take it over to the disc sander. Assuming you don't have a drum sander in your shop, we'll take it over to the disc sander and flatten one surface so that we can adhere it to the solid wood bowl that we're going to use this as an accent piece on. Now the next thing we're going to talk about is what technique can you use in order to correct a ring that you just have not been able to get to close up correctly, where your miter angles were off enough that it's simply not going to pull together. You're going to have too large a gap between one or more of the segments. The technique that is frequently used is called the half ring technique. And what you do in that circumstance, where you just can't get the full ring to pull together correctly, is you glue half of the number of segments together in a half ring, and the other half obviously separately from that. And then you would, after those half rings are glued together, you would put them together like this with a small dowel in between the two sides, and then put a ring around it, a hose clamp, and tighten as soon as I get that sitting upright, tighten the hose clamp around it and clamp them together using this technique until the glue sets. They don't really have to be centered down here, but there we go. And then you would let that fully dry. Then once that's dried, you then have half rings that you have to find a way to get sanded in a way that will allow you to finally join them together, to glue them and give you what will be a fully round ring when it's done. Now when you do that, keep in mind that's going to throw the joints off a little bit if you were to use additional rings on top of it, but for our purpose, if you were just adding one ring onto a solid wood bowl, you would not notice that that there was any misalignment in the joints. So the next thing we're going to do is show you how, once this has dried, how you would take this over to your lathe, assuming you didn't have a big disc sander in your shop, but you might be able to create a disc sander to use on your lathe. Fairly straightforward process to do, again beyond the scope of this presentation to do, but we'll show you what my disc sander looks like, and we'll show you how you would use it at the lathe to sand these edges to a point that you could join them together to make a nice tight circle. All right, now we're going to continue with explaining how we go about correcting rings that we haven't been able to cut accurately. Once again, we glue these in the half ring method with the dowels in between. Now we're over at the disc sander on the lathe. Again, this is just a simple MDF disc that you can make and attach to either a faceplate or put a recess in the back and attach it using a chuck. Very simple attachment to your lathe that increases greatly the versatility of the lathe. What we want to do is be able to sand these in such a way as we can, so that we can close up the gap that's showing here, since we need to be able to make that nice and straight. And we do that by simply laying the pieces on the table and sanding it until it's flat. So let's do those one at a time, see how that goes. All right, we're right about 600 RPMs. That one sanded to the point that the surfaces seem to be flat. All right, now we'll go to the next one. All right, now we'll begin the second piece. You can see the gap that still exists in this piece. We'll gradually take that down to where it's even. Try to exert even pressure on both sides. Let's test that fit. Make sure we don't need any additional sanding. All right, now we have both of these halves sanded, and if we've done it correctly, these should fit together very nicely. Once we push them together, that gives us our nice tight joint that we were not able to achieve using the miter cuts that we had. So we would simply glue it and clamp it in this fashion, and then we have our fully segmented ring. All right, now we've taken the ring that we just cut and glued and clamped. It's now dry, and we are adhering it to whatever scrap piece of wood we have. This is just a melamine disc that I have in the shop. Glued it on with 4 pieces of double-face tape on the other side. Little small pieces are fine. You just don't want to glue it with only 2. It'll rock a little bit too much. Just glue it. Use 4 pieces of double-sided tape and adhere it to whatever piece of wood you're going to use. And we're simply going to hold this against the disc sander until we get a nice flat surface. The squiggly lines that we put in are also excellent witness marks to be able to show us whether we have evenly sanded this. So we'll keep an eye on those as we begin the sanding process. This is again in lieu of using a drum sander, assuming you probably don't have one in your shop, but this is a pretty effective technique to at least get one side of a segmented disc sanded smooth. So keep an eye on those. You can see we're getting many of the witness marks out, but not all. Still got a little bit showing. Still got a little bit right here. All right, we have a nice flat surface, nice tight joints all the way around, so that gives us the very nice segmented ring that we want to add to our solid wood bowl. So the next step will be to show you how we adhere this using this flat surface against the outer surface of the rim of the bowl. After we finished sanding the one side of the ring, we then have to adhere that ring to the rough turned solid wood bowl, and we adhere that using the tailstock as a clamp press, if you will, simply gluing the outer surface of the rough turned bowl and setting the ring on, and then using a clamp block set in the tailstock and holding that in place until the glue dries. Once that dries, we're at the stage where we need to do the final turning to turn that ring into an accent ring for the solid wood bowl. All right, now that the ring has been adhered to the solid wood bowl and is fully dried, the next step is to turn the ring into a configuration so that it is serving simply as an accent to the existing solid wood bowl. So we'll turn the outside until it's smooth with the outside of the bowl, turn the inside until it's smooth with that, and put whatever shape on the outside the wood seems to tell us is appropriate for that kind of bowl. So let's begin the turning process. Now we're going to begin the turning process, and I'll begin by turning the outside surface of the ring, and then we'll move to the inside. And you can see how the ring is now nice and smooth all the way around and is just a little bit underneath the surface of the rough turn bowl. So we're going to use the gouge and scraper mode to simply even out that surface, that joint a little bit, and see how that turns out. Now we have a nice joint in between the two. We're not going to do the final turning of the outside of the bowl or the inside today, but just to show you how you would adhere this ring to the bowl and get a nice joint here. Let me smooth this out just a little bit more, and then we'll move on to the inside. There we go. All right, now we're going to go on to the inside. Got a little bit to go on the inside. See if that's going to be a profile that we're happy with. And for a rough turning at this point, we'll finish it up at a later point, but for a rough turning at this point, that gives us the configuration that we want, just to provide a simple little accent ring, a walnut ring on the outside of a rough turn cherry bowl. All right, that does it for today's first part of the segmented bowl turning presentation, where we've added this accent ring to the top of a solid wood bowl. What we're going to do in the second part of this presentation on segmented turning is to build on the skills that we learned in making this single ring and turn that into a construction of multiple segmented rings like this that we will stack together and turn into a completely segmented bowl. So look forward to that in part 2 of this presentation.